Welcome into the GigEm247 Sports Podcast. I am Andrew Hattersley, joined as always by Carter Karels, a pre-maroon and white spring game edition of the podcast. We're going to take a good look at the spring game, of course, and look back over the spring. Got to talk to Jimbo Fisher on Wednesday and Max Wright and Damani Richardson as well. Carter, how's everything been going?
Going great, man. Ready for the spring game. It's flown by for sure.
I feel like the anticipation's kind of building a little bit now. Everybody's obviously really eager to see what Bobby Petrino is going to bring to the table. This will obviously be fans' first opportunity to really get an extended look at what the offense looks like under him. Give always my yearly caution. There'll be guys sitting out because of injuries and all that, so don't try to take too much from the spring game. But a good opportunity to see some of the young guys nonetheless, and just get an early feel. Just starting looking back at this spring, A&M's now 13 practices in the books. Got another media window on Wednesday, short one. Feel like got a little bit of stretching in there. Got some special teams drills, and then got a few minutes to see some individual drills. We'll start on the offensive end. Are there any big takeaways that you have getting to watch this offense, or just a feel from what you've got over these 13 practices?
Yeah, I think spring practice is a lot about first impressions with newcomers and early enrollees, and even just, hey, how much did this guy change from last season? And I think when we talk about just the newcomers, the two that stood out right away and the two that have kind of continued to progress throughout the spring were Chase Basantis and Ruben Owens. With Chase, he's been kind of the talk of the town here the last week or two. With someone probably a few practices in, they said, you know what? Yeah, we don't have Trey Zoom. Yeah, you're not a left tackle, but we like you more than the other options at right tackle that aren't named Ruben Fothery. So why not move Ruben Fothery to left tackle and Chase Basantis can start at right tackle? I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't think he is the day one, game one starter for Texas A&M once Trey Zoom comes back. It makes a lot of sense to have Zoom at left tackle and Fothery at right tackle. But it gives you some sort of safeguard. And Ruben Fothery is somebody who, I wrote about how he kind of trains as a left tackle and a right tackle. So if he had to make that move, he could. Whereas a lot of guys, sometimes they only train one position or one side of the offensive line, and making that move can be quite difficult. Well, I think it's, for an offensive line that we really thought struggled with depth, it has one more layer to the depth than we previously thought. We thought Basantis might be a guy may not see the field. Year one freshman, they rarely see the field in a good scenario on an offensive line. But for Basantis to have that trust already in Steve Adazio, I think is a great sign. Ruben Owens, mentioned him a lot, but just doesn't seem to be a gap between him and the other guys in that room with Amari Daniels and Le'Veon Moss. And Moss was banged up for probably the middle part of spring camp, and that gave Owens some opportunities to kind of show what he's got. And I think he delivered in those moments. And then wide receiver, obviously that's a stacked room, but the depth is where the concern is. And when we talked to Jimbo yesterday, he confirmed Tyron Smith is for sure looking to go back to UTEP now. So now you got 7 scholarship players there. Probably want to add 1 or 2 more guys in the transfer portal. Obviously, Gary Bryant's a guy they're looking at. A couple more positions, tight end. I've talked about how Donovan Green has been head over shoulders better than the other guys in that room, just from an eye test perspective. Gained 15 pounds since last season. Just seems really crisp in drills. Doesn't make a lot of mistakes. You see the tight ends coach, James Colby, getting on the other guys a lot more. And then I think what we know about Bobby Petrino is he's someone who wants to use a lot of tight ends. And so you look at this room, and I think they've got a lot of guys that can fill different niches. Max Wright, I think he's very underrated as a blocker. I think he can give you a lot of stuff in those blocking, 3rd-and-1 situations, or even as a pass blocker as well. And then as far as Jake Johnson goes, he's somebody who doesn't really look like a tight end. It's almost like he's this really big receiver. And so, hey man, getting that guy in the passing game a little bit more and not as much in the run blocking situations that Max Wright would be in. I think it makes a lot of sense if you're trying to use a lot of different tight ends in your offense. Quarterback, last one, Connor Wigman, Max Johnson. They say it's a competition. It doesn't look like that much of a competition. I think Max Johnson is a solid backup. I think he could start at a lot of different Power 5 schools. But I just think Connor Wigman has a lot of talent. He's a lot more mobile than Max Johnson. He's got a lot more of a live arm. And he's somebody that when you talk to a lot of people in and around the program, he's just got this confidence, this poise, this sort of way he carries himself that isn't really typical of a guy who's a true sophomore. So, when you look at a guy like that, I think he's a natural leader that people kind of gravitate to. So, the offense does have some depth issues at wide receiver and offensive line, but I think they've had a pretty good spring to build on. They just got to get a little bit more healthy at certain positions.
No doubt. I think when you look at a guy like Chase Besantis, and Jimbo Fisher said he's had an awesome spring. I believe Max Wright really raved about him as well, and said he was a guy that was going to shock a lot of people. He was one of the top rated offensive linemen in the country in the 2023 class, and the more and more you start to hear about him, obviously he's running with the ones. When you start to go through a fall, it feels more and more like he's a guy that could really factor in as a freshman, whether that's in the interior on the offensive line, if injuries start to happen, or if that's at right tackle, if they need him in a pinch with Ruben Fothery and Trey Zune, if anything happens to either one of those two guys. It really feels like Chase Besantis has emerged as an option they could turn to, similar to 2 years ago when A&M turned to Ruben Fothery and Bryce Foster in the middle of the season. Those two guys were able to give them productive snaps. It feels like Chase Besantis is kind of trending in that same direction. And on Ruben Owens, I think he's a guy that's just a natural football player. He's a guy that has a ton of experience, obviously carrying the ball in high school, was basically their offense for El Campo and had the ball in his hands every single time. And I think you'll see all three of those guys in Le'Veon Moss, Amari Daniels, and Ruben Owens kind of factor into the backfield this year. And it's a good situation to have. I think that's probably the strongest room A&M has. And wide receiver, I agree with you. I think they need to add, and we'll certainly get more into the transfer portal later in the show. And Gary Bryant's a guy that is still mulling a decision. A&M said, "Hey, listen, you have a spot to come in here and compete and make an impact." But I think they've got some other options as well. Shamar Kirk is a guy that's coming in this weekend. I think A&M has an opportunity there. Told me this was going to be probably his last visit. And so feels like an opportunity there for A&M to maybe add to that room. But I think there's been some encouraging signs, and as we get more into Jimbo Fisher's press conference, I think there was some other encouraging signs on the defensive side of the ball. It's some guys that have caught your eye as well.
Yeah, it's hard not to see Shamar Turner, just what he looks like. I mean, a guy that's like 300 pounds and can play tackle and end. I know it's a big debate. You can call him a tweener. You can say he's probably more of a tackle, but for A&M, they like to move him around all across that defensive line. And my goodness, just how fast that guy can move at that size.
Yeah.
You don't see it very often. but you see it pretty often with the rest of A&M's D line. They just have so many guys: Walter Nolan, Gabriel Brownlow-Dindy, Shamar Stewart, LT Overton. It's just like, my goodness, man. Like, this whole D line is absolutely stacked. Now, D end is a little bit short on numbers, but I think you can uh, be confident with the top guys there. Fadil Diggs was out of practice yesterday, but doesn't seem to be that big of a nick for him. So yeah, I feel really good about that defensive line. I think the linebackers have been. You can't really read too much from them in spring practice. They're not doing any competitive drills. Linebackers, you can't really evaluate them unless they're actually live. So, but you look at some of the early enrolled freshmen in that group: Tarian York, Damian Sanford. You like what they look like, right? You like how they move around. You like how big they are. Like they're not bad looking players by any means. Cornerbacks, I feel like you can get a little bit more of a sense of them in the limited viewing windows we get, just because they'll do these drills where they got to change direction and they've got to backpedal and decelerate on a dime. So like there are some drills where you can kind of see how fluid of a mover they are. And a guy that stood out to me yesterday was Tyreek Chappelle. It was his first practice that we've seen from him since the very first practice of the spring. Obviously was out for a few weeks with personal reasons, but just didn't look like somebody who was not practicing for 3 weeks. I mean, I was very impressed with, like, okay, anybody sits on the couch for 3 weeks. I mean, they're not going to be, their best athletically. Not to say he was, but like it looked like he was a guy who had practiced all spring, and I was very impressed with just kind of his movements and his change of direction. Tony Grimes is another guy who you're just impressed with what he looks like, and obviously he brings the starting experience. McCall's the same way. I think at the cornerback position, you feel good about your starters in Chappelle and Grimes, and you feel good about one of your backups in Sam McCall. But after that, it's like, okay, who else is there? And so I think that's the problem for this cornerback group that they're probably going to need to address here soon. And safety, I mean, we talk about nickel as well. Bryce Anderson, I mean, that guy, he's probably the best athlete of the whole defensive back room. I was watching him return kicks yesterday. I was like, my gosh, this guy, his just acceleration is unbelievable when he's got the ball in his hands. I think people at first were like, why is he returning kickoffs? But man, it took like 2 returns for me to say, okay, yeah, I understand. And then, I mean, the rest of the group, safety, you bring back your starters, you bring back your experience. Damani Richardson, Jardine Gilbert, both of them have been a little bit banged up this spring, but you feel pretty good about that position group. You feel good about the depth. It's really just cornerback and linebacker where the depth is kind of So overall, a good spring for this defense, but definitely some concerns to address.
No doubt. And you look at Bryce Anderson, I mean, he's just probably one of the better all-around athletes you'll find. I mean, in high school, he played quarterback and was basically leading that offense, and just a guy that you feel like you can put in any sort of position and he's going to be able to do it all. Has a great feel for the game. Did not look out of place at all when he played as a freshman, and I think that was a natural kind of replacement for Antonio Johnson. I agree on the depth at cornerback. I feel like they can use at least maybe one more guy there, just because you don't want to have to, if possible, you want to give those freshmen time to develop, right? You want to give Javon Thomas, Bravion Rogers is going to arrive in the summer. That's a lot to ask for him to come right in and be able to make an impact as a freshman in the fall. Bobby Taylor is a guy that I think is intriguing on what we kind of see Saturday. Was obviously hurt most of last year, and so that's a guy I think that's intriguing to be able to see. Switching gears a little bit to just Jimbo Fisher, as I mentioned, got to hear from him on Wednesday. I think this is the third time we've heard from him this spring, and definitely I feel like the most upbeat he's been this spring. Was really pleased. He said with the way practice has gone, with the way the energy, physicality, and competition has gone so far. Raved about the offensive line, as I mentioned. Talked about Chase Besantis, talked about Remington Strickland, Mark Naboo. Now he does like to kind of hit on every guy. You saw him kind of circling
It felt
guys
like
on
a
the
roll
page.
call.
He kind of likes to make sure nobody was left out and everybody was kind of at least mentioned. But I thought he was pretty upbeat about the way things have gone, and they've kind of just quietly gone about their practices, and I think that's the kind of spring A&M needed.
Yeah, I still think about that first presser. Not from me. Like, I don't care. Like, whatever. But A&M, it's more like I went into the top 5 storylines of the spring before spring camp, and number one was let's make this a boring spring, and let's make it where there's no headlines, there's no talk, and that first press conference, I'm willing to overlook it. Like, I don't like in the moment you care about it, but like after a week, it's like, okay, well, he's answering questions about Petrino now. Clearly, he's whatever. But like from a national media perspective, and fans from the outside, the casual fans, they're going to take that first press conference and they're going to continue to talk about it this offseason. If there's another flare up, remember that, So like the objective of having a boring spring, I think that one press conference is kind of that one dark spot for this program. Again, I don't think it was a huge deal. I'm just saying people on the outside, remember when him and Petrino are clashing. And that's not the case. Like, from everything we've heard, like, everything's been going pretty well so far between those two. It's just people on the outside that will have their opinions, and that's just the one thing that I think, having the boring spring, that's probably the one thing where they didn't have it. Outside of that, though, you mentioned him being upbeat. I feel like he's been like that in every press conference except that first one. And it's great to just hear him talk about football. I mean, he can be very insightful about his players, about the game. He's very opinionated. I mean, he was talking about the spring game, the idea of playing another opponent. And you hear a lot of coaches just kind of give this, yeah, that'd be cool, Yeah. But they're either just like not wanting to expound upon that, or that's not really how they feel. And I can appreciate that Jimbo is saying, like, no, I don't want to do that, because I'm just going to like get my players injured. Like, there's no gain out of it. There's no, now I don't agree with him. Like, for me, selfishly, I'm like, hey, it'd be pretty freaking cool if they played Houston in a spring game. Like, that would be fun to analyze, it'd be fun to talk about. Selfishly, I'd love that, but I also don't blame him for saying, hey, what am I getting for this? This game doesn't count. There's not really that big of a financial gain potentially, unless you create one. And like, am I just going to get my players hurt for no reason? Whereas I can just kind of control the environment if it's my own spring game. So I appreciate that he's willing to just say stuff sometimes that other people may be afraid to say or aren't willing to say. And I did think he made some good points about it, even though, selfishly, I'm like, man, I sure would love that. That'd be really fun to see him go up against North Texas or whoever.
Yeah, I think even Damani Richardson kind of, when he was asked about it, said, would I love to do that? Absolutely. Like, be like a great idea, and would it be smart? He's like, I'd have to do more research. I don't know. I don't know if it would be. And I feel like that's kind of that attitude, right? Like, he made a lot of good points. One of the things, for those that didn't get a chance to see, one of the things he brought up is, okay, well, how do you protect the quarterback? Obviously, in the spring game, if you have your own spring game, you can kind of say, hey, don't hit the quarterback. But, what if Connor Wigman or Max Johnson takes a shot at the knees, and then suddenly you're kind of in scramble mode to figure out what you're going to do at quarterback? And, they are at this point midway through the offseason program, right? Like, they've obviously got kind of that summer session to go where they're going to do more conditioning in June and July and really start to ramp up for fall camp. And so I certainly understood his point. I think he hadn't really heard about it either. He's kind of a guy that, we've talked about this before. He's not on social media. Does not want to be on social media, does not care about social media. And so, he's not really seeing like the banter going back and forth. And, he kind of said, if it ends up happening, I'll do more research and thought into it. I think he genuinely has just been focused on
Yeah.
like the recruiting angle. So I don't think he's seen like the full conversation. Like, is there the charity component to it, or does the money go to charity, or anything like that? I think it'd be interesting to get his perspective if it ended up happening. Kind of, well, what are you going to do? Because, as you mentioned, are you going to sit out first string players or guys that you don't want to get hurt? And is it going to kind of turn into a Hall of Fame game type of feel? So certainly brought up some very interesting points. And um, it'll be interesting to kind of hear from him on Saturday again. Obviously, after the spring game, we'll be able to kind of talk more about um, what A&M was trying to get accomplished and what they did get accomplished. To your point about Bobby Petrino, was asked about some scheme stuff and really gave some good answers. That, it's, when you talk about scheme and you talk about terminology, it's whatever makes the most sense for the players. Kind of said it isn't his scheme, it isn't his philosophy, or Bobby Petrino's philosophy for that matter. It's whatever kind of the players fit best. And so um thought it was probably his most insightful and open press conference of the spring, and a lot of good things came out of it. So we're going to talk about another angle that he was asked about on Wednesday, right after a quick break, and that is the transfer portal. The second window opens on Saturday, excuse me. And so we're going to dive right into that right after a quick break. Welcome back into the GigEm247 Sports Podcast. I am Andrew Hattersley, joined by Carter Karels. Carter, we are starting to see some guys, obviously, as I mentioned right before the break, with the second portal window opens on Saturday, starting to see some guys declare their intentions, as we kind of saw the first go around. And Matthew Wyckoff was obviously one name for A&M that announced on Wednesday that he was planning to enter the transfer portal on Saturday. Just starting with him, what was your reaction to that news, and where that kind of leaves A&M from an offensive line standpoint?
Yeah, you never want to lose a depth piece, but it's also not the end of the world. So I
Mm-hmm.
think the center position was one where we looked at before the spring. We said, man, Bryce Foster's coming off a torn ACL, should be good to go by preseason camp. Should be the starter. It would be a shock if he wasn't the starter.
Of
But
note, he's doing track this spring, so that kind of gives
yeah,
you the indication.
yeah, that as well. Uh, but is he injury prone? Is this a one-time deal? Like, will he play the whole season? That could determine how big of a loss this is. And then Mark Naboo, as you know, his second year has really grabbed hold of that starting position in Bryce Foster's absence. And, you know, he's still new to the position, but it seems like the coaches have a lot of confidence in him. They've you know, Jimbo said a lot of good things about Naboo. So, you know, maybe it's very possible that he passed up Wyckoff on the depth chart. And if that's the case, you know, are you gonna see your third team center leaving and say it's the end of the world? I don't think so. Also, you know, people will look at like, oh, well, he was on the all freshman SEC team. Well, sometimes those things are just like made up, right? Like sometimes
Yeah.
they just look at the star ratings and they say, oh, I can remember there was an offensive lineman at Notre Dame. It was a 5-star recruit, Tommy Kramer, and every year he was like a preseason All-American, even though he was their worst offensive lineman every single year. So like some of these things are just made up. If you looked at the Pro Football Focus numbers, he gave up the most pressures among centers in the SEC last year, even though he split time at that position with Foster. So he still had a lot of development left in him. He was someone that was really put in a bad spot last year. Wasn't expected to be the starter. Wasn't expected to, you know, be thrust in a position where he was going to need to have a significant role. But Bryce Foster's injuries kind of created that a void for him to have to fill. And so, you know, Wyckoff, certainly a guy who a few years down the line, you know, as a junior, senior, I thought he could have been a pretty decent offensive lineman. But to be asked to do that right off the bat to start your career first couple of years, that's a tall task to ask any offensive lineman. So as poorly as he played last season, it does not mean that that's what he's going to be his whole career. I think he's someone that could go to another program, Power 5 for sure. He could. He could be a great player, a Group of 5 program. I think there's a lot of different destinations that he could go to and be a pretty solid player. He just needs to develop at his own pace and not be thrown to the fire like he was last season. So, you know, I say all that. You also want to prevent the next Matthew Wyckoff from happening. You don't want to throw another guy in the fire because he's left. So it's going to be really important for this offensive line to have Bryce Foster healthy all year, because as great as Mark Naboo has been this spring, he's new to the position. He's new to snapping. And I don't think you want to ask that guy to start any games next year. You want Bryce Foster to be that guy. You want him to be fully recovered from his injury, fully healthy, and that would be what inspires the most confidence from that group, I think, this fall.
No doubt. And you know, when you look at Bryce Foster, I think, look, his year never really got going. It felt like he was sick to begin the year, was kind of in and out during fall camp, and then, you know, obviously gets hurt in the Alabama game and misses the rest of the year. And you're right. I mean, Matthew Wyckoff is a guy. He was a guy that was rated as an offensive tackle coming out of high school, and then kind of moved inside, learned that center position, learned snapping. Had some problems there. Snaps were a big problem for A&M last year, and contributed to some of those quarterback struggles. I think from a depth standpoint, it does hurt. I think A&M was already kind of light on experience when you look at the offensive line. And one of the things you were pointing to was, well, everybody's back for another year, and so you know, you hope that offensive line takes that step. I'm with you. I think Bryce Foster needs to stay healthy. That's the biggest key. If he stays healthy, this probably isn't an issue. And you know, you can feel good about Mark Naboo as a backup. They've clearly loved what they've seen from him. I think, you know, Jimbo Fisher kind of mentioned it, that he's had a great spring, has been running with the ones all spring. And so, you know, they clearly feel good about where he's at. Jimbo Fisher was also asked about kind of where, and it's been a discussion point all off season long, is A&M's kind of sitting at around that 74 mark scholarship wise. And was asked about, getting up to the 85 mark and said, listen, during his time at Florida State, they were never really there. They were always kind of in the 81, 82 range. Said they've been in roughly the same spot since he arrived at A&M. This is going to be an important weekend on the transfer front. I feel like just to address some of those needs we talked about. Among the expected visitors this weekend is Boston College defensive back transfer Josh DeBerry. A&M and Wisconsin are kind of the two schools it seems like are pushing really hard for him right now. Would fit in that nickel role, but could also play on the outside as well. Got a linebacker coming in as well from Jackson State. So got a couple guys coming in. Juriente Davis. Wanted to make sure I got that. So Juriente Davis, he's a transfer linebacker from Jackson State. Shamar Kirk is a junior college wide receiver, as I mentioned, that A&M will likely be his last visit. And so some important, I think, hitting at positions of need right then and there. We talked earlier in this podcast about linebacker, defensive back, and wide receiver, and A&M will have 3 guys in town this weekend at those spots.
Yeah, it's I went through the scholarship numbers. I know Sam Khan had written that was 75. Without Wyckoff, that would make it 74. I got up to 73, found out that, Micaiah Overton is probably a scholarship player. So that's 74, and that's kind of where the -1 was there. So they're at 74, but A&M is a little bit weird. It's not uncommon. A lot of places are kind of secretive about their scholarship count. But a Randy Bond, for an example, was a walk-on for A&M, but are we sure he's still a walk-on? And I try to ask around. People are like, yeah, Jimbo's real secretive about that. We can assume that they're probably in the mid-70s as far as scholarship count goes. So you could probably see them add, optimistically, anywhere between 6 to 10 players in the transfer portal. The question really is, are you just filling some spots for depth? Are you willing to take C-plus players that are never going to start for you, just so you can fill the space and have more competition at practice? Or are you willing to are you okay with having 80 players, or can you have 84 players, but the 4 players you add are kind of that's kind of the question that I have, because I think they're going to go after these good players. Josh DeBerry, right? 3-time All-ACC guy. Like, there's going to be some of those, but probably not as many as there were in the first portal window, where it's right after the season. It's a 40-day window. This time it's only 15 days. They can't get any SEC players. That's another big roadblock. There's no SEC to SEC transfers in this window. So they're kind of limited on the guys they can get, and there's going to be a lot of competition for the limited amount of players they could get. So, I think they could maybe get a few pretty good players, but after that, you may have to say, yeah, this guy may never start, but he's a warm body, and there's some guys you could probably get like that just have 1 year left and are happy to be there. I can remember covering Florida State last year. Right before the season, they had a few numbers that they could fill, and there's a guy from Jacksonville State, Malik Feaster, a cornerback. He's coming off like a torn meniscus or some sort of knee injury. So he wasn't even going to be available the first few weeks of the season. It was really just going to be a guy that could be available at practice and kind of have some good, healthy competition with cornerbacks and receivers. And they're like, yeah, sure, let's take him. And he never ended up being more than a special teams player and somebody to come in and blowouts. But sometimes you need those guys just to kind of fill up your roster if it's only for a year. Now, you don't want to be on a books with a guy for 3 years and say, oh my gosh, we've got this guy who may never
Yeah.
play for 3 years. But if it's 1 year and you have to have the space, why not? Why not? So that's kind of what I'm interested to see. But the one roadblock is Jimbo Fisher has never, ever been a big transfer guy. He's probably taken, 7 in the last 5 years? And we're talking about more than 7 spots that he could fill with transfers. So we'd have to be asking him to get more transfers in this window, a 15-day window, than transfers he's gotten in the last 5 years. Not to mention, they could be losing a few to a handful of players to this transfer portal. So we say 6 to 10 spots, but really it could be like 12 to 15 if they have some attrition and lose some guys. So if they're in the mid-70s now, they may be in the low 70s by the time, and maybe even high 60s by the time this window is over. So a lot of things can happen, a lot of things can change, but you'd like to see A&M be very active in this cycle because there are some positions, as we mentioned, linebacker, cornerback, and wide receiver in particular, D-end a little bit, but not too much, where you could add some guys in there, I think.
No question. And you look at some of these guys that they're bringing in this weekend, right? And Gary Bryant's a guy that, as I mentioned, they had in earlier this spring. And right now he's kind of looking towards a May decision, it seems like, but that really seems to be an A&M, Oregon, Arizona battle. And A&M would love to add him, and I think you would feel really good about the wide receiver room if you're able to pull him in. And then Shamar Kirk, I think, is a guy that has nice film, right? Is a guy that's looking for an opportunity, is excited about A&M, feels like a pretty winnable recruitment. You've got Purdue, UNLV kind of in the mix. Feels like a recruitment that A&M can win and gives you some security at that wide receiver spot. With Juriente Davis, he's got a couple other visits kind of said. He's coming off a visit to Kentucky, so there's SEC interest there. If you add him, given some of the buzz there has been around Torian York and Damian Sanford this year or this spring, I feel like fans and the coaching staff would come out of this spring feeling pretty good. You were kind of looking at it. Okay, A&M needs to add one linebacker this cycle, just to one or two through the transfer portal to really feel good and really feel stable. And if you can do that, you have Edrin Cooper and Chris Russell and Marshall Harris. And, if you can add Juriente Davis, you feel pretty good about that with Torian York and Damian Sanford having some more time to kind of develop, contribute in spots. You start to feel pretty good about that. Jimbo Fisher was asked about the transfer portal on Wednesday and said, A&M plans to be pretty active. Now he cautioned you've got to have, and it's a discussion point that has been had ad nauseum on the board and about, you got to have starting spots to sell. And A&M obviously brings back a lot of young players that saw significant playing time last year. And why are kids entering the portal? They're entering because they didn't get playing time at a previous institution a lot of times, and they're looking for an opportunity to play. So, it's kind of on the coaching staff to kind of paint that picture. And, you're going to win some recruitments and you're going to lose some recruitments. Tank Booker, a Maryland defensive lineman, was a guy that they brought in for a visit. And, I think the role he was kind of envisioning was just more than A&M was really able to provide along with the defensive line. And that's okay. You brought him in on a visit. You got a feel for him. And he ended up going somewhere else where he feels like he's going to be able to play a lot. And that's kind of what guys are looking for in the transfer portal. Now, I do think there's some opportunities if it'll work out. Brennan Thompson's a guy who also, his name surfaced on Wednesday as somebody that's planning to enter the transfer portal. Texas A&M was one of the schools that was very much in the mix for him. He got really close to Jimbo Fisher. It's kind of that country feel, loves to go hunting and fishing. Him and Jimbo Fisher really bonded on that during the recruiting process and talked about that. And so, if he's a guy that's willing to come in, has multiple years of eligibility left, we've talked about that before. That's an opportunity in the transfer portal. If a guy similar to Sam McCall, I feel like we talked about, a guy that maybe this year isn't the year that you come in and walk into a starting spot, but you have an opportunity to come into a role in an environment you feel like you fit in, and have a role. He could be a dynamic special teams guy. I feel like A&M could plug him right in as a punt or kick returner, and he could really impact the game there. The slot position, as we've talked about, is pretty deep this year with Moose Muhammad and Anais Smith, and you've got Micah Tees there as well. And so fit wise, I'm interested to kind of see where that kind of goes, if he's looking at a spot where maybe the depth chart is a little more favorable. But just wrapping it up here and putting a bow on the transfer portal, if you had, say, 3 positions you feel like A&M absolutely has to get a transfer portal guy, what do you feel like those would be?
Well, if I was going to rank them, I'd probably put offensive tackle number 1. I know you feel really good about Chase Basanis and the growth that he has made, but I still think if he's starting game 1, I don't think that's a good thing. He seems more like, I think he can develop into a great right tackle. I feel like season 1 he'd be more of a fit as a guard, just seeing how he's built, how he moves. But right tackle, he could play it, but I just don't think he could play it very well game 1. I think he can develop into a guy that's drafted, that's all conference, but just game 1 of your first year, that's a really tall ask for a freshman on the offensive line. So, and even just beyond him, I don't think you feel good about any of your backup options. You feel good about him just because there's kind of hope in the freshman, but I just, beyond Trey Zune and Ruben Fothery, not a lot of guys inspiring confidence in that room, and they're short on numbers. So, I mean, it's tough because offensive tackle is not a position you can really get in the portal. I mean, we saw it with Jameer Johnson a couple of years ago. That was an experiment that did not go very well for A&M. And even Jameer Johnsons are hard to find at that position in the portal. There're just not a lot of great offensive tackle. So I can say it's a big need, but are they going to fill it? Probably not. I still think it's worth having more bodies in that room if you can get a guy or two. So I do think it's still worth looking at that. Number 2 and 3, it's kind of a tie. I'll go with linebacker at number 2, just because this has been a defense that's really struggled against the run. I think having better linebacker play is a big part of that. We see how good this defensive line is. So these linebackers have to be better. I think you feel okay about the starters, Edge Cooper, Chris Russell. They're decent players. They're not world breakers or anything like that. But the depth is really the concern for me. I think, Damian Sanford, Tyron York, Martrell Harris, you like the idea of them and what they could be, but year 1, I just don't like playing early enrolled freshmen right off the bat at positions that are really hard to learn your first year and play your first year. So getting a couple transfers there would help. Cornerback, why I rank them 3rd is I think you feel really good about their starters. Tyreek Chappelle, Tony Grimes, very solid. And I do think Sam McCall is your top backup option. And then you throw around guys like Deuce Harmon, probably could play nickel, probably a little bit of outside corner maybe as well. You feel okay, but I think they could add 1 or 2 more corners in there that could really just solidify that reserve that they have at that position. They lost a ton of those guys to the transfer portal. So just kind of filling that void for to where you're not having to play Javon Thomas right away if there's an injury, because that's another position where you're like you're one injury away from being in trouble. So just
Yeah.
having one or two more buys in there, I think would help.
No doubt. That's probably the three that to me make the most sense. And then, like we said, kind of wide receiver would probably be that fourth one. But encouraging the way Noah Thomas has talked about this spring, and I think he's a guy that when you talk about people that can make a second year jump, I think he's somebody that if A&M had to rely on him as a sophomore, they could, and I think he could definitely be pretty productive. So, going to be pretty fascinating to see how this team kind of continues to progress, what A&M is able to do in the transfer portal, and whether they are pretty active. How it's encouraging that they continue to bring guys in. I think there is more work to do, and we kind of talked about that. That you know they're going to target people that they like, and if they see a guy that they're going to bring in, they're going to try to get them on campus and make things happen. So still more work to be done there, and should make for kind of an intriguing May or June as we hit um, as we hit official visit season as well. Carter, enjoy the spring game on Saturday. I'm sure it's going to be a pretty fun one to kind of again get to see Bobby Petrino. To everyone else heading out there, enjoy it. There's some football on the field. That's the good news. You get to see guys in action, and the spring will certainly be, or the fall will certainly be here before we know it. As a reminder, if you haven't done so already, be sure to like and share these videos and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And subscribe on Apple and iTunes as well. And until then, we'll see you guys soon. Thanks again.